Today, we're diving into 8 caving expeditions that took a deadly turn. From unstable cave collapses that trapped explorers deep underground to uncertified dives that ended in tragedy, each story is a chilling reminder of just how unpredictable and unforgiving these adventures can be. So, without wasting another second, let's get started. And as always, viewer discretion is advised. On December 27, 2003, 8 boys from the San Antonio Boys Village in Florida set out for Boy Scout Cave, led by 2 counselors. Among them were 15-year-old Michael Sherrow and 16-year-old Javik Henderson, eager for adventure and ready to take on the Florida cave's tight, twisting passages. The counselors, citing their size, chose to stay at the surface. The boys went in alone. Boy Scout Cave in Florida was known for its narrow crawls and sharp turns, but it had a reputation for being dry and structurally stable. With only 9 flashlights between them, the group entered the cave shortly after noon. As they descended, the temperature dropped to a constant 72 degrees Fahrenheit, and daylight quickly vanished behind them. One counselor lit a small campfire near the entrance to stay warm. What he didn't realize was that this harmless fire would become a critical factor in the Boy Scout Cave rescue ahead. Michael and Javik led the way through the tight maze. The deeper they crawled, the more the cave seemed to press in around them. The air was still and the silence unnerving. About an hour in, they reached a sharp, narrow bend called the Hairpin Curve, a known choke point in the cave. The group paused at the narrow bend. Without their counselors, uncertainty crept in. Michael, trying to stay confident, took the lead and entered the Hairpin Curve. This passage was the tightest they had faced, a narrow horizontal slit with a sharp 180-degree turn. Jagged limestone walls pressed in from all sides. The ceiling was low, the floor uneven, forcing anyone through to twist and crawl in awkward angles. Michael squeezed ahead, disappearing around the bend. Henderson followed, inching his body through the tight space. As he reached the curve, he twisted to follow the angle, but then stopped. He couldn't move. Wedged in the bend, he was stuck. Panic set in. He tried to shift his body, but nothing budged. His breathing grew faster, echoing off his own. Michael, hearing the distress, turned to help. The rest of the boys waited in tense silence, their voices echoing faintly through the cave. Michael crawled back toward the curve, forcing himself into the narrow space beside Henderson. The jagged limestone scraped their skin as they struggled in the tight, airless crawl. Michael pulled and pushed, trying to shift Henderson's body, but the rock pressed in from all sides. Henderson was locked in place, twisted unnaturally. Sharp stone dug into his ribs and hips, shooting pain through his body with every movement. It felt like the cave was crushing him.
Minutes dragged into an hour. Exhausted, Michael kept trying, but the cold stone drained their body heat fast. With no room to move and constant contact with the damp limestone, their strength began to fade. Then Michael's vision blurred. His arms weakened. He could no longer fight the cave. Without warning, Michael collapsed, his body going limp against the narrow rock walls. Henderson, still trapped, felt panic surge. His friend was unconscious, and he couldn't move. All he could do was scream for help, his voice echoing down the passage. The rest of the group, still in the wider section, heard the shouts. Flashlights flickered as batteries wore thin. Panic took hold. They realized how serious the situation had become. 2 boys were now in real danger, and they couldn't reach them. Fear spread fast. Some began to worry the campfire outside was burning up the oxygen, making it harder to breathe. Their confidence vanished. The Florida cave suddenly felt smaller, colder, deadlier. Reluctantly, they made a choice. They couldn't save Michael and Henderson alone. Crawling back through the cave, they left their friends behind and raced for the surface to call for help. Outside, the counselors had no idea what had happened. When the boys emerged, breathless and wide-eyed, their panic said it all. The counselors quickly put out the fire and called 911. One stayed behind to comfort the shaken group, though their words offered little reassurance. Within the hour, rescue teams arrived. These were seasoned cavers, familiar with the cave's narrow crawls, but even they knew this would be difficult. Boy Scout Cave's tight passages were hard enough to navigate without hauling rescue gear. And with concerns about oxygen depletion, the pressure was intense. Inside, rescuers found the boys huddled together, pale, crying, and convinced the air was running out. The fear of suffocation hung thick in the cave, but after testing the air, experts confirmed there was no oxygen shortage. The panic had fed itself. What the boys feared wasn't real. It was psychological, not physical. That news brought a wave of relief, but the mission wasn't over. 2 boys were still trapped deeper in the cave. Michael and Henderson were still trapped. The Florida Cave Rescue Team wasted no time. Armed with harnesses and chisels, they followed the route the boys had described. The passages were too narrow for bulky gear, so rescuers relied on minimal tools and sheer effort.
At the hairpin curve, the situation was dire. Henderson was conscious but shivering, his skin pale and damp. Michael lay motionless just ahead, barely breathing. Both were slipping into hypothermia. The rock had drained their body heat, and now time was their biggest enemy. Rescuers quickly assessed the scene and began freeing Henderson. The space was suffocatingly tight. Using small chisels, they chipped away at the limestone, each strike echoing through the cave. The rescuers had to twist and crawl, mimicking the same tight squeezes that had trapped the boys. It took over an hour to free Henderson. When he finally slid out of the hairpin curve, he sobbed in relief, his body stiff, trembling from cold and exhaustion. Rescuers wrapped him in a thermal blanket and began the long, slow journey to the surface. Then came Michael. He was still unconscious, his condition critical. The team worked faster, chiseling through solid rock to widen the passage. Each second dragged as they fought against the cave's grip. After nearly 2 hours, they pulled Michael free. His skin was ice cold, pulse barely there. They secured him in a harness and began the agonizing climb out. Every crawl and twist was a battle. The rescuers pushed through, inch by inch, knowing they were racing the clock. When the boys finally emerged, medics were already in place. Emergency crews rushed in, wrapping Michael and Henderson in thermal blankets, starting treatment on the spot. Both were rushed to the hospital, suffering from severe hypothermia after cave rescue. Henderson was alert. Michael remained unconscious for nearly 24 hours. In the aftermath, it was clear what went wrong. The counselor's choice to stay outside, while not malicious, left the group without leadership inside the cave. And with too little equipment and not enough preparation, what should have been a simple exploration turned into a near-fatal Florida cave incident. On February 25, 1967, 2 friends, Ralph Bucca and John Locke, entered Overholt Blowing Cave in the biting cold of afternoon. This Overholt Blowing Cave rescue would go down as one of the most chilling hypothermia survival stories in caving history. Layered in long-sleeve shirts, jackets, and outer suits, they believed they were ready for the challenge ahead. Many real-life cave survival stories begin with similar confidence, but nature often has other plans. Before going in, they spoke with the cave's owner, G. Dallas McKeever. He warned them about the dangers: freezing water, brutal temperatures, and how quickly exhaustion could set in. He didn't stop them, but he made it clear the risks were real. The dangers of caving, especially in places like Daredevil's Passage, are a harsh reality for explorers. Ralph and John were undeterred. Confident in their insulated gear, they brushed off the warnings. To them, the cave was an adventure, not a threat. But that confidence wouldn't last long. Inside, the reality was far colder and far deadlier than they had imagined. This is a classic case of caving tragedy turning adventure into a survival nightmare. As they descended deeper, the cave's icy grip tightened. Cold streams cut through the rock and damp air pressed against them. Their headlamps lit narrow beams across the glistening walls as they moved through the quiet, broken only by their breath and the splash of water beneath their boots. Such scenes are typical in real cave expeditions, especially in hypothermic environments. About 30 minutes in, they reached Daredevil's Passage, a 500-foot crawl through near-freezing water, infamous even in good conditions. The moment Ralph entered, the cold hit hard. Water soaked through his layers, clinging to his skin, draining his body heat with every inch forward. Daredevil's Passage is notorious among cave explorers, often cited in cave survival documentaries and rescue accounts. John led the way, moving carefully and calling back to check on Ralph, but by the time they reached the mountain room, Ralph was in trouble. He flexed his fingers, trying to bring back feeling, but his hands stayed numb. His legs were stiff, barely responding. The cold was winning. This is where signs of severe hypothermia in cave environments begin to manifest, making rescue difficult. "We need to turn back," John said, watching Ralph struggle to keep pace. Ralph nodded, pride giving way to the cold reality closing in. In many real caving survival stories, that moment of turning back becomes a fight against time. The way back was brutal. Daredevil's passage felt longer, colder, tighter. Ralph's body was failing, each movement slower, each breath shorter. The cold was inside him now, sapping his strength inch by inch. Cave rescues involving tight, freezing crawls are some of the most dangerous missions in speleology. Halfway through, Ralph collapsed onto the wet ground. His hands shook uncontrollably. John dropped beside him, panic rising. "Come on, Ralph, we're close," he said, trying to lift him. But Ralph's legs gave out. He slipped back into the freezing water, unable to stand. Moments like these highlight the real risks of hypothermia during cave exploration gone wrong. What was once a place of curiosity had turned into a merciless trap. John knew he had no time to waste. Dragging Ralph's limp body through the narrow crawl was agonizing, his own strength fading fast, every muscle burning with exhaustion. The cold gnawed at them like a predator, draining the last reserves of energy and will. Ralph's head lolled to one side. His face was pale, lips tinged blue. When his eyes slipped shut, John froze. Was he still breathing? "Stay with me, Ralph," he pleaded, shaking him gently. A faint groan answered back. It was enough. In cave rescue scenarios, even the faintest sign of life offers a glimmer of hope, just enough to keep pushing. Fueled by desperation, John pushed through the final stretch of Daredevil's Passage. Each movement was a fight against the cave itself. When they finally broke into the main passage near the entrance, John's hands were scraped raw, his body shaking uncontrollably. But Ralph was fading fast. His skin had turned ashen. His breaths were shallow and weak. His body had gone rigid, a terrifying sign that hypothermia had taken hold. This terrifying Overholt blowing cave story has become a prime example of cold cave survival told in underground exploration circles. John knew time was slipping away. With every ounce of strength left in him, he half-dragged, half-carried Ralph toward the faint glimmer of the entrance ahead. The cold night hit them like a wall as they stumbled out of the cave. Gasping for air, John rushed Ralph into the nearby shed, urgently stripping off his soaked clothes and replacing them with dry ones. In hypothermia rescue protocol, rapid rewarming and dry clothing are critical first responses.
The shed's small stove flickered with weak heat, barely enough to combat the deep chill that had sunk into Ralph's body. His pulse was faint, irregular. John rubbed his limbs fiercely, trying to coax warmth back into them, but Ralph didn't respond. Panic gripped him. He couldn't do this alone. Emergency cave rescue efforts often depend on fast, improvised care before paramedics arrive. He bolted out into the night and found McKever, who wasted no time and ran back with him to the shed. Working together, they lifted Ralph and hurried him to the house, every movement driven by raw urgency. Teamwork often becomes the key difference between life and death in stories of survival in caves. Inside, they sprang into action. McKever set pots of water to boil, while John continued rubbing Ralph's limbs, his hands trembling. Steam rose from the hot compresses, but Ralph was fading fast. His breathing had become barely audible, his body slipping further toward the edge. This intense hypothermia story in a real cave highlights how quick thinking can reverse even dire situations. It took 2 agonizing hours before Ralph stirred, his eyes finally opening to the soft glow of the room. Bit by bit, his body began to recover from the brutal ordeal. He had been minutes from death, saved only by John's unwavering resolve and the tireless efforts to keep him alive. Survival stories like Ralph's are powerful reminders of human resilience and determination under extreme cave conditions. The cave had pushed them to the brink, a ruthless reminder of nature's indifference and how thin the line is between survival and tragedy.
August 15th, 2000. The morning light barely reached the limestone cliff as 15 teens from Camp Wilderness stood at the entrance to Duffield Cave. Group leader Mr. Peterson checked his watch and did a final head count. 17-year-old Emma Jeffrey adjusted her helmet and tested her headlamp. She wasn't new to this. She'd explored dozens of caves across Pennsylvania with her family. The cave yawned open before them like a dark mouth. Emma stepped in with the rest, adrenaline rising. For the first hour, everything went smoothly. They crawled through wide passages, slid past flowstone, and entered a massive chamber with soaring ceilings and ancient stalactites. Emma's beams swept across the formations as they pushed deeper into the system. Then they reached the section locals called the Pretzel, Duffield Cave's most twisted passage. It snaked through the rock in tight, unforgiving curves. First a crawl, then a sharp climb, a left twist, sudden drop, sharp right, and finally an angled squeeze toward a distant chamber. Most of the group hesitated. Many chose to turn back. The Pretzel looked brutal, tight, twisted, unforgiving, but Emma had faced worse. She studied the entrance, mentally tracing the sequence. Up, left, down, right, then up again. A puzzle she'd solve with her own body. She dropped down headfirst and began army crawling into the passage. Her headlamp lit smooth limestone walls shaped by ages of flowing water. The space barely cleared her shoulders. The first upward bend came fast. She twisted, pressing her boots against the wall to push herself up. Her helmet scrimped the ceiling. The rock was cold against her body. Next came the left turn. Emma rotated her torso to follow the curve, her shoulder grinding one wall, while her hip brushed the other. The passage tightened. Then the drop, narrow and steep, like sliding into a mail slot. Her chest pressed against the rock, ribs tightening with each breath. Her breathing grew shallow. Behind her, faint voices echoed, but they were distant now. The right turn changed everything.
Panic hit instantly. Her heart pounded as she realized she was stuck completely. Every movement wedged her in deeper. What felt snug moments ago now squeezed like a vice. Her chest tightened. Breathing became quick and shallow. Her headlamp beam jerked as fear shook her body. The surrounding darkness crept in, turning the narrow tunnel into a coffin. Despite the cave's chill, sweat soaked her face. She tried to scream, but the pressure on her lungs choked the sound. Only faint gasps escaped, swallowed by the rock. Her friends, just 30 feet away, couldn't hear a thing. Until one of them finally realized she wasn't coming out. Their voices echoed through the cave, calling her name. When Emma finally answered, her voice was weak, but it was enough. The urgency in their replies told her they knew something was very wrong. The next 4 hours were a blur of panic and failed rescue attempts. Her friends tried everything. They pulled her legs, but the twisted tunnel made a straight pull impossible. They pushed from behind, only to wedge her tighter. Then came the mistake. They poured water around her, hoping to reduce friction, but the limestone soaked it up instantly. Worse, the cold water clung to her body, leaching away her warmth. The cool cave air turned harsh. Emma's body temperature began to drop. Hypothermia set in slowly, then all at once. At first, she trembled. Then the shivering turned violent. Her muscles clenched uncontrollably, making the tight space feel even tighter. Her thoughts blurred. She couldn't focus. Her mind began to drift. She started whispering to the walls, apologizing, pleading, asking the cave to let her go. Meanwhile, above ground, a full-blown rescue operation was taking shape, one that would soon be remembered as legendary in Pennsylvania cave rescue history. It started when the landowner dialed 911, shaken by the panic in Emma's friends as they stumbled out of the cave. First came the local police, then the fire department. Paramedics followed close behind. Within hours, specialized technical rescue teams from 3 counties swarmed the area.
They tried anyway. They lowered equipment, sent their smallest firefighters into the tunnel, but no one could reach Emma. The passage's tight, twisted shape stopped every attempt. It didn't matter how brave or skilled they were, this was a different world, and the usual tools didn't work here. As the sun dipped behind the trees, turning the sky orange and purple, someone finally made the call that changed everything. They reached out to the local caving community. Within an hour, veteran cavers from across the region were arriving at Duffield Cave. These weren't just explorers, they were people who lived underground, people who knew how to move through rock like it was second nature, people who understood that saving Emma would require more than gear. It would require strategy, patience, and nerves of steel. Eventually, one of the rescuers, small, wiry, and experienced in navigating impossibly tight spaces, managed to reach Emma. He squeezed his way to her position, took in the scene, then carefully backed out to discuss the next move with the rest of the team. And that's when the breakthrough came. The solution was surprisingly simple and just a little embarrassing. After hours stuck in the narrow passage, Emma's clothing, soaked with water, sweat, and cave grime, had swollen and bunched up in critical spots. In a place like the pretzel, where even a half-inch of extra bulk could be the difference between freedom and being wedged in place, this seemingly minor detail was everything. So the team got to work. They removed most of Emma's clothing with precision and care, doing their best to preserve her dignity while prioritizing her life. Then, they reached into their kit and pulled out something unexpected: cooking oil. The rescuers coated her skin generously with the oil, creating the kind of slick surface that water simply couldn't provide against the thirsty limestone. Slowly but surely, the rock began to release its grip. What followed was a delicate hour-long operation, every movement calculated, every angle considered. They didn't just pull her out, they reversed the entire journey, guiding her body through each twist and bend in reverse, carefully supporting her weight and making sure she didn't catch or jam at any point.
It wasn't brute force that freed Emma. It was patience, planning, and a deep understanding of how the cave worked. When Emma was finally pulled free from the pretzel's narrow jaws and propped back to the surface, she was barely clinging to consciousness. Her body was ice cold, her skin pale and clammy, the early signs of hypothermia written all over her. Hours trapped in damp, unmoving rock had trained her completely, both physically and mentally. Paramedics moved in immediately. Warming blankets were wrapped tightly around her, and IV fluids were started to rehydrate her and stabilize her vitals. She couldn't speak much, her energy nearly gone, but she was alive. And miraculously, aside from a few scrapes and bruises, Emma had made it through the entire ordeal without a single serious injury. She walked out of that hospital with a new understanding of risk, of survival, and just how terrifyingly tight the line is between life and death deep underground.
September 24th, 2005, Sequoia National Park. 8 researchers gathered at the entrance of Empire Mine Cave. Leading the team was Shane Freer. With him were Mindy Goldberg, a 25-year-old explorer, Dave Bunnell, a 53-year-old veteran, and Joel Despain. Their mission? Explore and document the forgotten ruins of a silver mine carved into the earth back in the 1870s. Empire Mine Cave doesn't welcome visitors easily. The entrance is a vertical pit, straight down. No walking in, no gentle slope. To reach the cave floor, you need ropes, harnesses, and precise technique. Each team member prepared carefully. Ropes were anchored to solid points. Every knot, every carabiner, every harness was checked and rechecked. In vertical caving, one mistake can be fatal. Shane went first. As team leader, it was his job to test the descent. His harness was locked in. Headlamp switched on. Rope system loaded. And then, one step at a time, he disappeared into the darkness below. Shane moved slowly, scanning each section as he descended. A lead caver's job isn't just to go down, it's to read the cave, spot hazards, test anchor points, keep the team safe. Above, the rest of the group waited, gear ready, nerves steady. The real journey was just beginning. Shane's rappel into the entrance pit went smoothly. Once he was secure at the bottom, Mindy began her descent. She followed the same path and landed safely.
Without pause, she moved past Shane and into a narrow chimney passage that extended deeper into the cave. Shane stayed behind, watching as Mindy disappeared.
Chimney passages are a different kind of challenge. These narrow, vertical cracks force cavers to wedge themselves between opposing walls, using their backs, feet, and hands to inch through. It's slow, awkward, and physically demanding, very different from walking a horizontal tunnel. Next up was Dave Bunnell. At 53, he was a seasoned explorer. His rappel was flawless, the ropes held firm, and he reached the bottom of the pit without trouble. But caves don't follow rules. Even after decades of stability, a shift underground can change everything in seconds. Dave was about to face that reality. As Dave began his descent into the chimney passage, following the same route Mindy had just taken, the cave turned hostile. Without warning, a rock that had sat undisturbed for who knows how long suddenly broke free. No one knows exactly what triggered it. Maybe it was the repeated foot traffic, maybe it was a subtle shift in temperature, or maybe it was just time finally catching up to the cave. Whatever the cause, the result was immediate and brutal. The rock struck with precision. It crushed Dave's cave pack against the wall and clamped down on his leg, wedging him tightly in the narrow chute. He was completely stuck. Trapped in the space, barely wide enough to move, Dave now faced one of the worst-case scenarios in caving, a chimney entrapment. With walls pressing from both sides and the stone bearing down, any rescue would be complicated and slow. But Dave had something on his side: experience. Decades of caving had trained him for chaos. Instead of panicking, he stayed calm and began to assess the situation. Moving had to be precise. One wrong shift could trigger more rockfall or worsen the jam. Ironically, the same pack that got him stuck might have also saved him. Wedged between him and the full weight of the rock, it acted as a buffer. Just enough to keep things from getting worse. Now, the real test began, getting out before the cave decided to shift again. Using a mix of sheer determination, practice technique, and raw strength, Dave finally managed to wriggle free from the crushing grip of the fallen rock. But the relief was short-lived. What he saw next made his stomach drop. The rock hadn't just tumbled down and rolled away, it had lodged itself firmly into a new position, sealing off the narrow chimney passage. What had once been a navigable route was now completely blocked. In a matter of seconds, the cave had reshaped itself, and with it, changed everything. Below the obstruction, Mindy was now trapped. She had passed through safely just minutes earlier, but now that same route was gone, cut off by a massive slab of immovable stone. Alone in the tight lower section of the chimney, she was confronted with a chilling realization. She was sealed inside, isolated from the rest of the group, and the only known exit. The sound of rockfall, followed by Dave's frantic calls for help, snapped Joel Despain into action. As an experienced caver, he immediately understood the seriousness of what had just happened. Cave rescues are never simple. The unforgiving terrain, narrow spaces, and unpredictable structure make any intervention slow, risky, and complex. And now, their situation had shifted from a close call to a full-blown emergency, with a teammate trapped and time working against them.
Even with a trio of seasoned explorers on hand, Joel's rapid descent into the cave marked the start of a desperate makeshift rescue. There was no time to wait for a formal team or specialized equipment. What they had on site was all they could count on. Unlike surface rescues where professionals can swarm in with high-tech gear and manpower, cave emergencies demand something else entirely: skill, ingenuity, and nerves of steel. In these lightless chambers, the only lifeline is often the people already inside. Now facing a crisis deep underground, Dave, Dane, and Joel found themselves staring down a brutal problem. A massive rock, far too heavy for one person to move, stood between Mindy and her only escape. Shifting it even slightly would require more than strength, it would require engineering finesse under crushing pressure. The three men leaned on their years of experience, quickly transforming into a team of underground problem solvers. Every move had to be precise. They examined the rock from every angle, searching for leverage points, debating force application, calculating risk in real time. One wrong nudge could trigger another collapse. But they had no choice. This wasn't about moving rock, it was about saving Mindy's life, and the cave wasn't giving them much time to get it right.
The tight confines of the chimney passage severely limited what the team could do. There was no room for pulleys or large equipment, just raw human strength, simple tools, and whatever natural leverage they could muster from the cave walls around them. Then, after hours of calculated effort, came the breakthrough. The team managed to shift the massive stone just enough, just inches, to open a narrow space above it. The gap wasn't much. It looked impossible, but it was just wide enough for one determined person to try. That sliver of space was the line between a nightmare and escape, and Mindy was ready to fight for it. Mindy's escape wasn't just a climb, it was a test of precision, nerve, and endurance. The narrow gap the men had carved offered no margin for error. She had to contort her body with perfect control, every movement slow and deliberate, careful not to wedge herself or dislodge any loose rock. But inch by inch, she made her way through. When she finally emerged on the other side of the blockage, the cave was silent, then filled with a flood of relief. The nightmare was over. Even after ensuring Mindy's safety, the team didn't walk away immediately. They attempted to reposition the rock, hoping to restore the chimney to its original state, not just for themselves, but for anyone who might enter this cave in the future. It was a gesture of respect for the cave, for the caving community, and for the land itself.
October 31st, 2004. Sarge Jimenez stood outside his home, sharpening his machete. His sons, 11-year-old Pascual and 6-year-old Miguel, watched closely. Pascual had hunted before, but for Miguel, this was his first time. Their village, Yoquib, was struggling. The harvest had failed, and meat was scarce. Tepes quintiles, large rodents known for their tender meat, often hid in the caves nearby. One of those caves, simply called La Cueva, sat just beyond their cornfield. Jimenez had a plan passed down through generations. The boys would enter through the large opening, make noise, and push any animals toward the second exit where Jimenez would be waiting. They had no flashlights, just pine torches that burned fast. As the sun dipped, they moved out. The entrance stood 5 feet high, thick with roots and vines. Jimenez gave his final instructions: stay close, head toward the second entrance's light, and keep moving. He'd meet them on the other side. 20 minutes in and out. The boys stepped into the cave. Jimenez vanished into the trees. Inside, the passage tightened fast, forcing them to crouch. Then it opened into a chamber about 20 feet wide, the ceiling rising to 10 feet. Across the room, a dim glow marked the second entrance, where their father waited. The boys clapped and shouted, their voices echoing through the chamber. A flash of movement, a Tepes quintile darted along the wall. About 22 pounds, it raced straight toward the second exit, right on cue. Outside, Jimenez tensed. He gripped his machete, watching the entrance. The animal burst through the vines. He swung, steel met fur, but the strike was off. Wounded, the Tepes quintile squealed and vanished back into the cave. Jimenez cursed under his breath. Losing a wounded animal wasn't an option. He called out to his sons, telling them what had happened. They needed to finish the job, both for the meat and to end the animal's suffering. 6-year-old Miguel didn't hesitate. He offered to go after it. Before Jimenez could respond, the boy turned and ran back into the cave. Pascual stayed behind, thinking his brother would be right back. But minutes dragged on. Miguel followed the blood trail deeper, past the main chamber. The animal, in pain and panic, had crawled into a tight side tunnel, barely 2 feet wide, and Miguel, unaware of what lay ahead, followed it inside. When Miguel didn't come out, worry set in fast. Jimenez handed Pascual a fresh torch and sent him in to find his brother. The daylight outside was almost gone, and a knot of fear began to tighten in Jimenez's chest. Pascual entered the cave, calling Miguel's name as he moved deeper. He followed the main chamber to the back, where he spotted the narrow side tunnel. Miguel's small footprints trailed into the cramped space. Pascual dropped to his hands and knees and crawled in after him. After crawling about 10 feet, the ceiling dropped even lower.
Now flat on his belly, Pascual kept going. 20 feet in, he finally heard Miguel's voice. The passage bent sharply left, then right, sloping downward. Pascual pressed on, determined to reach his brother. But time kept ticking. Neither boy returned. Night fully fell. With no other option, Jimenez entered the cave himself, navigating to the main chamber by memory. His voice echoed in the silence, no answer. Then he found it, the narrow crawl space with fresh prints leading inside. He tried to follow, but his broad shoulders stopped him barely a meter in. He shouted their names again. This time, faint voices called back from deep in the tunnel. He couldn't see them, he couldn't reach them, but he knew they were alive. Panicked, Jimenez rushed back to the village of Yoquib, waking neighbors and relatives. By midnight, a dozen men with torches had gathered at the cave entrance. One by one, they tried entering the crawl space, but none could squeeze past the first sharp turn. They could hear the boys, tired, frightened, but still calling. Somewhere deep inside that tunnel, likely stuck, was Miguel. Maybe both boys were now trapped. No one knew how deep the passage went or how narrow it became. But what came next would reveal just how dangerously complex this cave really was. The first 24 hours blurred into one long stretch of desperation. Men clawed at the narrow passage with their bare hands, digging feverishly to widen the opening, inch by agonizing inch. Women from the village came and went, quietly bringing food and water for the rescuers. But Jimenez didn't eat. He didn't sleep. He just sat, eyes locked on the black mouth of the cave that had swallowed his sons. By day 2, the story had spread to nearby villages. Dozens more arrived carrying tools, shovels, picks, hammers, anything that might help. The air grew heavy with tension. Every now and then, a faint sound drifted out from deep within the tunnel, just enough to confirm the boys were still alive. Rescuers extended bamboo tubes into the passage, hoping some water would reach the children. Whether it actually did, no one could be sure.
Inside, time had stopped for Miguel and Pascual. Hunger gnawed at their stomachs. The cold cut through their tiny bodies. Darkness pressed in from all sides. The narrow tunnel offered no room to turn, no space to breathe freely. Trapped in this nightmare, at just 6 and 11 years old, the boys drifted between exhaustion and silence, barely able to respond to the calls from above. Later that same day, municipal authorities finally arrived. With them came more powerful tools, battery-powered lamps, a small gasoline generator, and electric drills. Rescue efforts now stretched day and night, but despite the noise and effort, progress remained painfully slow. Crowds gathered around the entrance. Some came to help, others came to watch. Tensions boiled over. Family members begged rescuers to dig faster. Officials urged caution. Tempers flared. A man from a nearby village shouted that the authorities weren't doing enough. But Jimenez said nothing. He just stood there, silent, hollow-eyed, clinging to hope.
By the third day, rescuers had widened the passage enough to reach a sharp 90-degree bend about 6 meters in. The space beyond was even tighter, too small for anyone but a petite woman on the team. She weighed barely 45 kilos and stood just 1.5 meters tall. With a light strapped to her head and a bottle of water and food pushed ahead of her, she crawled into the narrow gap. She squeezed another 4.7 meters in before hitting a second sharp turn, this one even more constricted. She stopped. The boys were alive. She could hear them on the other side. She couldn't reach them, but the gap was just wide enough to pass water and food through. When she came back out, covered in dirt and her clothes torn, she told the team what they'd hoped to hear. The boys were still there, still holding on. That news sparked a surge of energy. More volunteers arrived, tools poured in. Officials called for help from the state. A medical team set up camp at the entrance, everyone prepared for the moment the boys would be pulled out. Jimenez, exhausted, finally accepted some water and tortillas. His sons were close. But things took a turn. As night fell, clouds rolled in over the Chiapas Mountains. October's dry stretch had ended. Rain began to fall, soft at first, then steady, then relentless. By midnight, it was a downpour. Water raced across the land, heading straight for the cave. Rescuers first felt it at their feet, a slow trickle that quickly became a forceful stream. Urgency surged. They had cleared the first constriction, making progress, but another 4.7 meters remained, including the tightest sections. The sound of rushing water soon drowned everything. Shouts echoed as the flow intensified. Those near the entrance were pushed back by the rising flood. Jimenez rushed forward, knowing his sons wouldn't survive if the water reached them. Rescue teams scrambled. They built makeshift barriers from earth and stone, digging trenches, trying to direct the water away from the cave entrance. Anything to buy time. But nature didn't yield. Water tore through the cave, flooding every tunnel, including the narrow side tunnel where the boys waited. Horrified, rescuers stood frozen. Some watched, powerless. Others fought the rising tide, refusing to give up. By the fourth morning, the lower cave was completely underwater. The narrow side tunnel, where the boys were trapped, was now a silent, flooded grave. Jimenez had to be restrained as he tried to force his way inside. He collapsed at the entrance, his cries swallowed by the roar of rushing water. Rain pounded for 2 more days. The boys' chances were nearly zero. The site turned into chaos, mud everywhere, hope slipping away. Villagers blamed officials for delays. Officials pointed to the weather and rugged terrain. Rescuers clashed over what could have been done differently. But none of it stopped the flood that now swallowed the cave, and all hope with it. When the rain finally stopped, the waters began to recede. State officials brought pumps to clear the cave faster. But what they found was unrecognizable: mud-filled tunnels, collapsed walls, and new rock formations. For a week, rescuers kept digging, clearing debris and pushing through caved-in sections. They reached the spot where a woman had once heard the boys' voices, but found nothing. Deeper in, the tunnel dropped 30 meters into a flooded shaft that disappeared into darkness. It might stretch for hundreds of feet. No one knew where it led. After 10 days, officials called off the search. They believed the flood had swept the boys' bodies deeper into the cave system, far beyond reach. No remains were ever recovered. Yet even after the rescue teams left, some villagers kept looking, driven by grief, mistrust, and the need for answers. But the mountain gave up nothing. The official report listed drowning as the cause of death, but questions lingered. Why had the boys gone so deep into such a tight, dangerous passage? Did Miguel get stuck chasing the animal, with Pascual staying behind to help? Or did a hidden collapse trap them before the rains came? No one would ever know for sure. The Tepsquinte, the creature that started it all, vanished too. Maybe it slipped deeper into the cave. Maybe it died in some unreachable pocket of stone. Like the boys, it became a part of the mountain's silence. Jimenez was never the same. The man who once called the cave his second home never entered it again. On Saturday, December 14, 2024, a team of 9 experienced cave explorers gathered before dawn at the entrance of the Bueno Fonteno cave near Bergamo, Italy. Leading the group was 32-year-old speleologist Ottavia Piana. Their goal? Map uncharted sections of this vast limestone cave system. The Bueno Fonteno cave rescue mission begins here, led by expert speleologist Ottavia Piana. The Bueno Fonteno network stretched over 19 kilometers, but many chambers and tunnels remained untouched. Piana was no stranger to the risks. Just 17 months earlier, she'd been rescued from this very cave after breaking her leg. Still, she returned, determined to push deeper. This second encounter marked a turning point in the story of the Ottavia Piana cave accident. The team descended through known passages, winding through narrow corridors as temperatures held steady at 10 degrees Celsius, 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Hypothermia was a constant concern, and every move required caution. Roughly 4 kilometers in, they reached the end of the known map. Beyond this point lay complete darkness, terrain no human had walked before. Dangerous cave exploration conditions tested even the most experienced spelunkers. As they advanced, the passages tightened, the limestone walls twisted into sharp angles, and progress slowed. Each step had to be tested. The explorers moved carefully, knowing one wrong move could mean disaster. The Italian Cave Rescue 2024 would soon be triggered by a single misstep. At 4:30 p.m., disaster struck. This moment marked the critical incident of the Ottavia Piana cave rescue operation. Piana was climbing across a ledge that looked stable. She shifted her weight, and the rock cracked beneath her with a sharp snap.
It had been hollowed over centuries by underground water, fragile and ready to break. Her teammates could only watch. Such cave accidents often highlight the hidden geological dangers explorers face. She grabbed at the rock, fingers clawing for a hold, but there was nothing solid. She fell, 5 meters down, spinning through the darkness. The fall ended in a brutal impact against jagged limestone below. This was the moment that triggered one of the most complex rescues in speleology history. The sound of impact echoed through the cave, sharp, sudden, final. Then, silence. Just the sound of dripping water and the eerie stillness that followed.
Piana's teammates scrambled to set up anchor. One of them rappelled down, guided only by the dim beam of his headlamp and the moans coming from below. What he found was horrifying. Piana was crumpled against the rock wall. Her left knee was grotesquely bent, swollen and twisted at an unnatural angle. Her face was barely recognizable, swollen from what looked like multiple fractures. She tried to speak, but the words came out slurred and broken. The only phrase they could make out was, "Never again, never again." Rescue teams would soon mobilize for the most dramatic segment of the 2024 cave rescue in Italy. The others stared in shock. The reality was sinking in, fast. They were 4 kilometers deep, beyond any mapped route. The passages back were narrow, steep, and unstable. No phone signal, no working radio, just tons of rock pressing down above and no way to call for help. Panic crept in. Every second mattered. Piana was slipping deeper into shock. Her breathing was ragged, her pulse weakening, but moving her in that condition could be fatal. Speleologist rescue operations face immense logistical and medical hurdles in such remote zones. The team leader had to make a call. One member would attempt a solo escape to the surface, hoping to reach help before it was too late. At 5:45 p.m., he started the climb alone through 4 kilometers of unknown, dangerous terrain. Every squeeze, every crawl, every climb could cost him precious time, or his life. This marked a turning point in the Italian Cave Rescue 2024 timeline. Finally, by 8:20 p.m., he burst out of the cave entrance, exhausted, covered in mud, and gasping for air, but alive, with a message that could save her. The Italian National Alpine and Speleological Rescue Corps, CNSAS, received the emergency call just as darkness settled over the Bergamo Hills. The voice on the line, ragged with exhaustion and laced with desperation, described a grim scenario unfolding 4 kilometers beneath the surface. Immediately, the command center sprang into action. Seasoned officers, veterans of countless cave rescue operations across Europe, instantly grasped the life-threatening complexity of the situation. Specialized cave rescue gear was loaded with surgical precision, stretchers designed for subterranean transport, thermal medical supplies capable of operating in prolonged underground missions, and kilometers of rope and communication lines. But even with all this experience, they knew every second they spent preparing was another second Piana lay broken and bleeding deep inside one of Italy's most unforgiving cave systems. The first wave of rescuers reached her at 8 a.m. on December 15th, nearly 16 hours after her brutal fall. Her condition was dire: multiple facial fractures, broken ribs, a grotesquely damaged knee, and signs of possible internal bleeding. Compounding it all was the silent, creeping danger of hypothermia, as she'd spent the night in a 10 degrees Celsius, 50-degree Fahrenheit cave chamber. With meticulous care, they stabilized her on a specialized underground stretcher, her body strapped in to protect fragile fractures and prevent further trauma during the grueling extraction. The ascent was a logistical and physical marathon. Teams of 6 worked in synchronized shifts, maneuvering the stretcher through claustrophobic passageways and vertical shafts. Every 90 minutes, they halted to assess both her condition and their own, because in cave rescue, a single slip in those tight, unforgiving spaces could spell disaster for everyone. Her consciousness drifted in and out, her breath shallow and pained, and through cracked lips and a shattered face, she repeated the same haunting words: "Never again, never again." By the third day, December 16th, rescue teams faced their first serious mechanical obstacle, a narrow passage choked with collapsed limestone. The same geological instability that had sent Piana plummeting days earlier was now threatening to trap both her and her rescuers underground. As teams attempted to task, the rock shifted without warning, creating fresh dangers with each hour spent below. The CNSAS Command Center, balancing risk and urgency, made the bold call to deploy small explosive charges to clear the obstruction.
These weren't decisions made lightly. Every detonation was precisely calculated to dislodge the blockage without triggering a collapse in the surrounding cavern. But beyond the rubble lay more peril. Seepage from the cave walls had turned the narrow path into a slick, muddy slope. Slipping was no longer a possibility, it was a certainty. To combat the hazard, rescuers installed fixed rope lines along the entire passage, giving the dozens of cave rescue personnel a lifeline to guide them through the treacherous terrain. Meanwhile, Piana's condition was growing increasingly fragile. She had survived 3 full days trapped underground, but her body was beginning to fail. Despite thermal blankets, chemical heating packs, and around-the-clock monitoring, her core temperature continued to drop. The air was dense with humidity, ideal conditions for pneumonia to set in, especially with fractured ribs that made every breath a battle. The medical team issued warnings. Her time was running out. By December 17th, the situation became a race against the clock. Commanders pushed the operation into overdrive. Fresh waves of trained specialists descended into the cave, and working shifts were extended to maximize every moment of progress. The temporary telephone cable network, now stretching the full 4 kilometers, 2.5 miles underground, provided uninterrupted communication between the surface and rescue teams, critical for coordinating movement and relaying medical updates in real time. As the world above held its breath, the teams below pressed on. They worked through the night, their determination unshaken, inching closer to bringing Piana home. By Wednesday, December 18, 2024, the operation entered its final and most hopeful phase. At precisely 1:30 a.m., the rescue team reached a critical landmark, the transition point between the unmapped caverns and the charted sections of the Bifurto Abyss. From here, the rescuers would be navigating through known territory, broader passages with fewer surprises and pre-positioned gear. But there was still a grueling 2 kilometers, 2.1 miles of difficult terrain between them and the surface.
Thankfully, progress quickened. These mapped corridors had been previously explored, documented in detail, and fortified with supply caches during earlier stages of the rescue. Obstacles that would have delayed them in the unmapped zone had already been accounted for. The stretcher, carefully stabilized and secured, glided more smoothly now, supported by fixed anchors, pulleys, and the practiced coordination of cave rescue teams who had rehearsed these very scenarios. And then at 6 a.m., nearly 12 hours ahead of even the most optimistic timeline, a group of exhausted rescuers stepped out of the cave entrance, carrying 23-year-old Giulia Piana back into the world. The cold mountain dawn bathed the scene in soft light as cheers and quiet tears broke the tension that had gripped the rescue site for days. Piana had been underground for 4 days, pulled from a depth of 4 kilometers, 2.5 miles, through both unexplored and treacherous terrain. She had survived what many are now calling one of the most complex cave rescues in recent European history. A total of 159 volunteers, including elite speleologists, medics, and underground rigging specialists, had worked tirelessly through unforgiving conditions to bring her out alive. Immediately after extraction, Piana was airlifted to a regional hospital for full evaluation. Doctors confirmed that the field assessments had been accurate: multiple fractured ribs and severe knee trauma, injuries made infinitely more dangerous by the cold, damp conditions of the cave. Yet, her vitals were stable, and against all odds, she had endured. When she finally began speaking again after treatment, her voice was weak but clear. Her first words, "I'll never go into a cave again." The rescue of Giulia Piana was more than just a fight against time. It was a battle through darkness, distance, and uncertainty. Over 96 relentless hours, 159 expert volunteers charted new paths through the Bueno Fonteno cave system, laying down 4 kilometers of communication cable in terrain that had never seen human footprints. It was a triumph of coordination, courage, and sheer human will. But for Piana, this wasn't just a physical rescue, it was a personal reckoning. Once a passionate explorer of the underground world, she emerged from the depths not just broken in body, but changed in spirit. The Bueno Fonteno system, which had already trapped her once before, had nearly claimed her life a second time.
From now on, it would stand not as a symbol of adventure, but a stark reminder of how easily beauty and danger intertwine beneath the surface of the earth. Some caves are never meant to be conquered.
George Lennon wasn't just a businessman or a DJ, he was a caver. Ever since diving into a Mexican cenote in 2014, he had dedicated himself to mastering some of the UK's most dangerous cave systems. In the caving world, George had a reputation: precise, careful, dependable. He didn't take shortcuts, he prepared for everything. This was a man deeply experienced in underground exploration and cave survival. On November 6, 2021, George joined two close friends, Melissa Bell and Mark Berkey, for a familiar challenge, exploring Ogof Effian Du, the Black Cave in southern Wales. This would become one of the most intense UK cave rescue operations ever recorded. It's the deepest cave system in the UK, over 31 miles long and dropping more than 900 feet underground. It's not just big, it's a labyrinth, a place where even the smallest mistake can become deadly. Many call it one of the most dangerous caves in the world. The cave is divided into 3 sections, OFD 1, 2, and 3. Each one comes with its own dangers. From the very entrance near Penwilt, the route descends sharply, requiring immediate focus and skill. The OFD cave system is notorious among extreme caving enthusiasts. One of the riskiest areas, the Upper Smithy, is known for its unstable rock and sudden drops. It's a tight, crumbling zone that's injured more than a few seasoned explorers. Beyond that, the main streamway cuts through the cave with rushing water that can block entire paths after rain. Fast currents, slick footing, one misstep, and you are swept away. This is why cave rescue teams train specifically for environments like this. The cave doesn't stop there. It narrows without warning, forcing cavers to crawl through tight, suffocating gaps. And then there are the vertical shafts, steep, sheer climbs that require ropes, harnesses, and absolute control. The OFD cave system changes constantly. A cave like this isn't just mapped, it's survived. You rely on memory, markings, and instinct. One wrong turn, one missed foothold, and it's over. It's the kind of cave where real-life cave rescue stories begin. But George wasn't careless. He had studied this cave, trained for it, and on that November day, he thought he was ready. He wasn't alone, but in a place like Black Cave, even the most experienced team can be pushed past its limits.
The plan was simple: a 6-hour cave trip with plenty of time to return for the evening fireworks at the South Wales Caving Club. Before entering Ogof Effian Du, George, Melissa, and Mark ran a final check. Helmets on, LED headlamps tested, backups included. Harnesses secured, ropes inspected, reinforced suits, gloves, and knee pads in place. Each carried dry bags packed with essentials, maps, compasses, and working communication gear. Their gear setup mirrored those used in cave rescue training drills. Rain had fallen through the morning, soaking the hills and turning the cave's entrance into a slick slope. Still, the group pressed forward. The first hour went smoothly. Controlled steps, steady progress, everything was by the book. George led with calm precision, guiding them through tight crawls and narrow turns with practiced ease. But the deeper they went, the more the cave changed. Moisture coated the walls, making handholds unreliable. The floor turned slick and unpredictable. George took note, but his confidence held. This wasn't their first time underground. Eventually, they reached a narrow passage, the kind that forced them to crawl shoulder to rock. Beyond it, the air felt heavier. The dripping grew louder. It was clear the rain above was now affecting conditions below. Flooding is a known threat in real cave disaster stories like this. The team paused. Going forward meant risking flooded passages. After a quick discussion, they made the right call: turn back. To exit, they had to cross the Upper Smithy, an unstable zone with sheer drops and loose rock. One wrong move could be fatal. Melissa crossed first, moving carefully across the slick surface. Then Mark. Both reached the other side and turned to watch George follow. George began the crossing, slow and steady. Then something shifted. A foothold gave way, and suddenly he was falling. George moved with caution, testing each step. The rock beneath him felt thin, unstable. He felt a shift, then suddenly the ground gave way. In an instant, he dropped 30 feet into darkness. He landed hard on jagged stone. The impact crushed him. His jaw shattered, ribs cracked, right leg twisted. Blood streamed from a deep cut across his face. Somewhere inside, something burned. His spleen was torn. He was broken, paralyzed by pain and alone. Mark saw him vanish and didn't hesitate. He scrambled down the fractured rock face. George was still breathing, but barely. His body trembled, limbs bent unnaturally, blood pooling beneath him. He reached him and took one look. It was bad. A real underground survival scenario was unfolding below the surface.
George's breaths came in shallow gasps, his voice barely a whisper. Mark turned to Melissa and said what needed saying. "We need help." He made the hardest call of his life, leaving his friend behind. Climbing out of Bueno Fonteno is slow even on a good day, but now every second counted. George's condition was fading fast, his mind slipping in and out. Melissa stayed behind, kneeling beside him. She whispered to keep him awake, to keep him anchored. The cave around them stood still, silent, as George clung to life in the darkness. Above ground, Mark burst from the cave, gasping for air, legs shaking. He raced to the car and drove straight to the South Wales Caving Club, where trained rescuers were on standby. That's when one of the UK's most dramatic real cave rescues began. Within the hour, a cave rescue team was deployed, armed with medical kits, climbing gear, and stretchers. They descended into the cave fast. The path was slick, narrow, and unforgiving. Time was against them. If George was going to survive, they had to reach him quickly. Below, Melissa stayed at George's side. His skin had gone pale, his lips quivering. Pain racked his body, and his breathing grew shallow. He held on, tethered only to Melissa's voice and the faint light of her headlamp. They were deep underground, and hope was fading. 2 hours after Mark raised the alarm, the rescue team's voices echoed through the tunnel, hope breaking through the dark. When they reached George, he was barely responsive. His breathing was uneven, his body ice cold. The rescuers moved quickly, assessing him on the spot. Every injury had to be stabilized. His limbs were braced, wounds dressed. Then came the hard part, extraction. The stretcher was carefully fitted around him, but the space was tight. Moving him meant crawling inches at a time. Rescuers squeezed through the rock ahead of him, guiding the stretcher over jagged ledges. Every shift risked further injury. It was slow, brutal, and delicate. One wrong move could cost him everything. The Bueno Fonteno cave rescue effort would become a benchmark in British rescue history. Outside, more rescuers and medics stood ready. Time dragged. The rescue team rotated in shifts, ensuring no one lost focus. The deeper sections demanded precise rope work. Every foothold had to be secure. Inch by inch, they carried George through the maze. It took over 24 hours. At last, as dawn broke, George emerged into the cold morning air. His body was broken, face swollen and streaked with dried blood, but he was alive. He was rushed to the hospital. Multiple surgeries followed. His jaw was rebuilt. His ribs slowly mended. His leg, though severely damaged, was saved. The road to recovery was long, but George pulled through.
It was late afternoon on April 19, 2012, at Cenote Chakmul in Quintana Roo, Mexico. Tourists were packing up, the day winding down, but as others left, 3 people were just getting started, a decision that would turn a dream vacation into disaster. Carlos, 28, had worked as a dive guide at the Cenote for 2 years. He knew the layout well, every passage, every chamber. He had done hundreds of dives and stayed within the safe zones where sunlight still reached through the water. But there was one thing his clients never knew. Carlos wasn't certified for cave diving. He had no business leading anyone into the dark, narrow tunnels that stretched far beyond the light. That day, he met a young couple from Brazil, Marina and Eduardo. They were newlyweds on their honeymoon, full of energy and excitement. For months, they had saved up for this trip to Mexico, and cave diving was the highlight. Eduardo, 26, and Marina, 24, were still new to diving, but they were eager. This was supposed to be a once-in-a-lifetime experience.
The couple had chosen a late-day dive to avoid the crowds. They arrived just an hour before closing, excitement radiating as they suited up. While they prepared, Carlos made a dangerous decision, one that would echo through the diving world for years. Earlier that day, he'd noticed something deeper in the cave zone. It wasn't part of the safe cavern area, but the rock formations were extraordinary. He had explored it before, far beyond where sunlight reached, and now he wanted to show it off. As staff began shutting down for the day, Carlos led the couple into the water. Other divers were already surfacing, their dives complete. He guided Marina and Eduardo through the first passages, pointing out jagged stalactites and sweeping limestone arches. The water was crystal clear, visibility stretching in every direction. Shafts of light pierced through, illuminating the submerged cave like an ancient cathedral. Small fish darted past, weaving through stone pillars. Marina stayed close to Eduardo, her eyes wide with awe behind her mask. This was exactly what they had imagined. But then Carlos began steering them past the boundaries of the cavern zone. The light faded. Shadows grew longer. They followed without hesitation, unaware they were crossing into a zone meant only for trained cave divers, a place that demanded experience, planning, and gear they didn't have.
The shift from cavern to cave was subtle. Overhead light grew scarce, the surface openings shrinking until they vanished. They had entered the dark zone, a place only trained cave divers should ever go. Carlos had dive lights, but he underestimated how quickly things could spiral. Around 80 meters from the entrance, an 8-minute swim in perfect conditions, he realized something was wrong. The tunnel ahead split into several passages. He hesitated. He wasn't sure which one led back. The stunning formations that had seemed magical now looked threatening under the narrow beam of his light. Marina was the first to struggle. Cave diving demands a different mindset, calm, controlled, and trained for zero-margin environments. With no visible exit, the pressure began to build. Her breathing sped up, her tank depleting far faster than normal. Eduardo saw her panic and tried to get Carlos's attention, but Carlos was too focused on the maze ahead. A guideline, a vital marker for navigation, floated just feet away, but in the disorienting dark, Carlos overlooked it. Marina's air ran low. She searched frantically for a way out, swimming upward only to hit solid rock. No exit, no air. Panic took over. Her movements became frantic, her mind consumed by the terror of being trapped deep underground. Seeing Marina in distress, Eduardo made a desperate choice. He tried to share his air. In open water, this might have worked, but inside a cave, with panic rising and space limited, it was nearly impossible. Now both of them were drawing from a single tank, and it was draining fast. Carlos finally grasped the gravity of the situation, but it was too late. Marina's air was gone. She inhaled water and began to drown. Eduardo clung to her, trying to pull her up, but there was no surface above, only solid rock. In the attempt to save her, he used up what little air he had left. Carlos watched helplessly as both clients slipped away. He tried to guide them back, but the cavern zone was too far. The darkness, the confusion, the pressure, it overwhelmed everything. Even though Eduardo still had some air in his tank, it wasn't enough. Not for a rescue. Not anymore. Above, the cenote had closed for the day. Staff noticed Carlos and the couple hadn't returned, but hours passed before anyone raised an alarm. It wasn't uncommon for guides to extend a dive or take a scenic route. No one imagined they were already gone.
As night fell and there was still no sign of the three divers, concern turned to alarm. Emergency services were finally alerted and a search operation began. Cave rescue teams from across the region were called in. Time was critical. With powerful lights and specialized gear, divers searched the usual cavern routes, then pushed deeper into the cave zone. By 2 a.m. on April 20th, the worst fears were confirmed. All three bodies were found deep in the cave, far beyond the safe limits of a cavern dive. Their positioning told a grim story. All three were facing away from the exit, lost in total darkness.
The investigation uncovered what had gone wrong. Carlos, though experienced in the cenote, wasn't certified to guide cave dives. Marina and Eduardo were only trained for cavern diving. None of them should have entered that zone. It was a fatal mix, an uncertified guide, inexperienced divers, and a descent into a place they were never prepared to face. The diving community was shaken. This wasn't just a tragic accident, it exposed a pattern. At Cenote Chakmul, it was an open secret that some cavern guides regularly crossed into the cave zone. Certified cave divers had warned them before, even chased them out. The drive to impress clients had pushed safety aside. For the families of Marina and Eduardo, the loss was unbearable. The couple had been married just months earlier, with their future ahead of them. What was meant to be a dream honeymoon had become a tragedy, one that would haunt those left behind forever.